Welcome back, everyone. It's another episode of the Weekly Market View with myself, the part-time trader. Great to be here with you as usual. Today we are celebrating a little bit of volatility in the crypto market, which means that I've probably got a bit more to tell you this week than I have over the last 4 or 5 episodes. We have finally seen a breakout on Bitcoin and also a reclaim of a really key level that hints at some more upside in the short term. I'll be taking a deeper look at that in just a moment, as well as talking you through whether or not it changes my macro view on the state of the cryptocurrency market and the future for Bitcoin over the next couple of years. So stay tuned for that. For a bit of a deep dive on Ethereum and Solana price action, and a look at some of the indices that we all watch for hints on the future of the economy and the future of markets. So we'll be taking a look at the Nasdaq and the S&P 500 before wrapping up with the chart that is frustrating me so much at the moment, and that is the dollar index. So we'll get back to that in a bit. Before we kick off, obviously standard stuff, nothing that you see in this episode or that you might see over on X on my feed at Part-Time Charts is intended to be financial advice. This is purely for entertainment purposes. I hope you find it entertaining and potentially at times informative, but I would hate to think that anybody is making financial decisions off the back of my analysis. So please take anything you hear with a pinch of salt and make sure you do your own research and make sensible financial decisions. Right, let's kick off with Bitcoin. Before we do that, I should have said, if you do like any of this content, and particularly if you're someone that tunes in regularly, please do hit the subscribe button and join the small but growing community of people that tune into these on a regular basis. It really helps me to know that the content is landing well and that you want more of it, and hopefully in the future it will mean I can bring you some exciting guests too. So hit the subscribe button and please do smash the like button too to help me grow the channel. Really appreciate everybody's support. Right, let's get started with Bitcoin. We've actually seen some movement, which is great. I think for the last few weeks, we've been trading in this incredibly tight range on BTC. We've largely been going sideways for probably 5 or 6 weeks now. And then last week into last weekend, we started to see this accumulation back at the edge of this descending broadening wedge. And as we started to break out, I was flipping long and then getting out of longs as we were kind of flirting with this resistance. And I was a bit worried that I might be caught on the end of a fake out that would lead to a bit more downside in the short term. But I have said for weeks that I think there's a decent probability this pattern breaks to the upside. We saw that last weekend. We broke out. We had our first daily close above the downtrend, and then we back tested this region here, and lots of people were still bearish here, and I publicly spoke about the fact that I had gone long. I used a fair bit of leverage as well. You can see very tight stop loss down here, the red line, and I've really enjoyed the price action this week, guys. I'm not going to lie. I mean, this has worked out as a really strong trade for me, and I certainly wouldn't advise anybody takes trades because I do, but I laid out my rationale for why I thought the upside was coming, that when we break this downtrend, even up here, you could see that the funding rates on perps, on futures, kept going negative. It felt like a lot of people were trying to catch a short. And eventually the breakout and the retest gave me a bit more confidence that we were likely to see some upside. And that has happened. And even today, green candle today, we're up about 1% at the moment. The market to me looks really positive in the short term. And there were 2 things that I was looking for. The first was, of course, that downtrend break. The second thing that I was looking for that would hint at further upside, and I've been talking about this for weeks now, is a reclaim of these lows here, which has been all the way back since November, has been a really key level for the price on Bitcoin. And lo and behold, what did we see as price broke through that area earlier in the week? On Tuesday, the last couple of days, we have bounced pretty hard off of this support and resistance zone as buyers have stepped into the market. And again, you know, Max Price has been talking about this quite a lot over on X, and is definitely somebody that I would recommend that you follow. He and I have talked about the fact that perps and futures have been, you know, funding rates on perps and futures have been going negative even over the last couple of days. So despite the fact that we've seen such positive price action, it does feel like people are still desperate to get into shorts. And I must admit, that's taken me by surprise. I wouldn't have thought that people would be shorting the market so heavily here, particularly after this breakout, but that seems like that's what we're seeing. And I suspect that this will continue to the upside. And as I've laid out for a few weeks now, the two key areas that I'm looking for: one, I suspect there is a fair amount of liquidity above these highs in the 100k region, and I think when you look at the liquidation heat map, you can see that is definitely the case. So 100k feels like the next stop to me, and potentially we flip that into support, or we consolidate under it for a little bit and then break to the upside. Eventually, I think there is a decent chance that we're going to move up into the 110, 115k region. And if I zoom out on the chart, you can see why, for me, that is a really key area. You know, it brings together the trend that has been capping upside for price all the way back into 2021. And when we get there, when we get up into that region, I've made no secret of the fact that I expect that to be a major top for Bitcoin, and that eventually price is going to roll over. Now, what I'd love to see over the next week, next 2 weeks, potentially a little bit longer, I'd love to see us get up into this region and for everybody to be screaming bullish. That would be, in my mind, added confidence to what I'm seeing from a technical perspective. I'd love for people to get bullish up here, for the market to swing heavily back towards bullish sentiment, only for people to get left behind as the price plummets. And for me, you know, I've spoken about this many times. I genuinely believe that at some point Bitcoin is going to correct by 90% plus, and I'm looking for a correction that over the long run brings us as low as potentially $3,000 to $4,000 in 2027. Now, stay tuned to find out why I have such a bearish take on Bitcoin. And if you go back and you look at some of the previous videos that I've uploaded, particularly the first one that I recorded, I think back in March, probably beginning of March, you will see that I lay out in detail why I believe there is a huge amount of risk built up in the market, and that ultimately equities are going to suffer a dramatic downturn, which will bleed into the world of cryptocurrency. So look, nothing has changed in my view on the higher time frame. I still expect Bitcoin to roll over in a big way, but as I've said many times over on X, you know, there's no point fighting what you see on the chart in the short term. So even if my bias is bearish over the medium to long term, this breakout here was something I couldn't ignore, and this was probably the first trade I'd taken in quite some time. You know, for me nowadays, I'm thinking about trading, you know, as little as possible, particularly given that I see some of these moves as counter trend. And when you look at the state of the altcoin market, you know, although we've seen a bounce recently as Bitcoin has picked up, there's still no denying that many alts are down significantly from their all-time highs. And in my mind, this is nothing more than a bear market rally. Obviously, that looks a bit different for Bitcoin because the price has held up fairly strongly. But the overall crypto market, I think, is on life support. And people might think that's a strange thing to say as I'm longing, but that's precisely why I am not looking to make too many trades. And it's only when I get these absolutely glorious setups, like the one that we had at the weekend, where price had broken out from this downtrend and back tested it as support, and funding kept going negative, I thought, you know what, this is too good to miss. Another great example of, like, if you pick your moments, right? And if you're not greedy and you actually take profits, some of the trades that this market presents you are absolutely glorious. I mean, this is one that I keep looking back on and thinking, gosh, if you find literally one or two of these a year, the probability is in your favor so dramatically when you see such a clear downtrend breaking and then holding a support. If you were to long here, you know, wow, what a move. You would have caught from the mid 60s all the way up into six figures on Bitcoin. And for me, those are the types of setups that I'm really interested in at the moment. I'm not overly obsessed with the lower time frames on the chart. I'm more looking at the bigger picture and trying to find a sweet spot on one or two trades every now and again, potentially to help grow the amount of capital that I've got for when eventually the day comes where I flip macro bullish on crypto. And when I do, I will be incredibly bullish, because I do think the future is bright for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but I think the headwinds that are facing into financial markets at the moment mean that Bitcoin is going to have a really tough time. And we know that this asset has a history of long, drawn out, extreme drawdowns of 80 to 90%. And I think if the economy suffers and equities roll over in the way that I think they do, then I can see no reason to believe that Bitcoin will be immune to that. So that's my view on Bitcoin. Looking for 110 to 115k to mark the top. And it doesn't have to play out exactly as I've marked here. It doesn't have to be a sort of V reversal from the top. We could get up here and we could dance around for a little bit before coming down a bit like we did here, where we saw this consolidation and a sweep of the highs before more downside. Who knows? But all I know is I will be taking profit on my longs up in this region and possibly trimming my exposure here at the 100k mark. Let's take a look at USDC dominance. So this has been one of the charts that has really helped me in recent months. I'm using this as a proxy for the health of cryptocurrencies, and obviously Bitcoin being the key one in that regard. And you might remember, I've got a long history with this chart, where back in the summer of last year, this is where I became really bearish on Bitcoin as we got this breakout above this key level. And then soon after we fell back under, and it became clear that this was some sort of deviation and that we were heading lower. And at the time, I forecast that we were going to come back down into these lows. You see this big support zone here, and that we'd see a really significant bounce that would take us up into this region. And the price action, not really price action because it's USD dominance, but you see what I mean. The action that we saw on this, really married up almost to a T with what I said would happen. Again, here we saw a breakout of another really key level that dates all the way back to summer of 21 that has held a support and resistance multiple times. And this breakout, for me, this is why, despite the fact that I was flagging this bullish setup on Bitcoin, I was hesitant to go long because USDC dominance had held above this key support and resistance zone on the 3-day chart. But the moment that this started to look wobbly, and indeed earlier in the week we fell back underneath this key SR zone, this begins to look like, to me, like another deviation. And at that point I drew this blue squiggly line and said that I expect USDC dominance to fall back into this 1.7, 1.75 region, which I still believe will happen. And what I would love to see is a combination of Bitcoin heading up into the 110, 115k mark at the same time as USDC dominance reaches this 1.7, 1.75 area. If that happens, for me, that's great confidence, gives me more confidence that the top might be in on Bitcoin, and I can start to think about positioning myself and taking profits at that time on longs. Likewise, another chart that I've been looking at a lot, and this one really is, for me, the price action on Ethereum is so clean, the levels are so clean, that I think this has, in some respects, this has more utility than the Bitcoin chart in gauging the overall health of the market. because I've been talking for many months now about this really key SR zone in the sort of 2150 area that has held as support and resistance, and then support and support and support. And earlier in the year, back in early March, that gave way, and we saw a really significant move to the downside of about something in the region of about 30 to 40%. And what's happened since then is that obviously price has bounced, particularly over the last week where Bitcoin has done well. And what I'd love to see is a move up into this support and resistance zone to take out this previous high here, only to get back under. And that for me will be a trigger for a pretty big swing short on Ethereum. And I've talked many times about the bigger picture on ETH. I won't go into it in great detail today, but I really believe that Ethereum is cooked. I think this structure, losing this massive uptrend that held for a couple of years, giving up this key level that has been a support and resistance zone dating way back to 2022. And if you look at the even bigger time frame, and I won't pull it up now, but if you look, I've posted this on X previously, if you look at the monthly chart, you can see that this massive uptrend that has held for close to a decade now, dating back to I think 2016, has given way and has been back tested as support. So all the signs for me are there that say Ethereum is going to struggle. I think there's still a huge amount of complacency in the crypto markets. I think people holding altcoins are still expecting alt season to turn up and rescue them from some of this dire price action. And I love the way that in crypto, what you seem to get is something like this, where you see this area holding as resistance for price. Price comes down, we see a bounce. Eventually we take out the highs that you see here, and once that liquidity has been swept, you see massive continuation to the downside. And I would love to see something like that here, where we come up, we take out these highs, price starts to roll over, and I think this will go much deeper. And I would be targeting this low down here, which from here would be more than a 50% move. So the dream scenario for me is Bitcoin comes up into 115 as USDC dominance bottoms here at 1.7, 1.75, and ETH begins to top out, having swept these highs back into this key support and resistance zone. And if all of that plays out perfectly, then I'll be taking profits on BTC longs and trying to find a position in a short on Ethereum, which I would probably hold down into the 1K region. So first of all, targeting these lows here, potentially taking out this big wick down in the late 800s. So that's how I'm thinking about playing Ethereum and Bitcoin. What else should we cover in the crypto markets? Let's take a quick look at ETH. So one thing I've tried to do a bit more recently is I've had lots of requests for lower time frame charts and people wanting me to give my view on trade setups. Obviously, you know, my real strength is predicting the bigger picture moves, and I've had a huge amount of success, less so with Bitcoin this year, in fairness. I think Bitcoin has chopped around and has bounced up and down, but the altcoin market, you know, there are so many charts that I've been able to post where the before and after, you know, what I've predicted will play out, and then what actually plays out in the months ahead has just married up almost perfectly. And so I think I'm developing a real strength for the higher time frame picture in crypto and in equities, but I'm also trying to give you guys the value that you're looking for when you're coming to watch these videos, or you land on my X page. And I know lots of you are thinking about trade setups and would just love to see, you know, how does someone like myself think about those potential moves. And Solana is one that, you know, played out really well. I said back at these lows that if we were to see a reclaim of this really key support and resistance zone that again dates back to March 2024, so it was held for over a year, we swept all of those lows in early April, price started to bounce back into this region, And as we got rejected off the low, I said, look, if we see a reclaim, and I drew this green squiggle, a reclaim of this area here would be the trigger for me to be thinking about longs. And that's what these green arrows were. It's played out perfectly. We got that green trigger a couple of weeks back, and I posted on X at the time, green trigger on Solana. Since then, the price is up considerably, I think over 20% over the last couple of weeks. And then recently, I think last couple of days, we've started to see a flip on this support and resistance zone here, which again was the second green trigger that I outlined when I laid out my plan for this trade. So this isn't one that I've taken personally. I'm more focused on Bitcoin, as I believe the volatility is slightly more muted on Bitcoin, and it means that it's potentially an easier one to trade. But if you were lucky enough to jump in and grab on this reclaim, you've certainly benefited, and I think there's more upside to come over the next week or so. I suspect eventually we will hit this target. I don't expect it to take that long to play out, actually, and it would not surprise me if price goes even further. And one thing that I would be watching for is these highs here seem really significant to me. So you've got obviously big resistance there, support, and then if you look back here, when I originally flipped bearish on Solana on the lower time frames, it was when this began to hold as resistance again. It wouldn't surprise me if we come all the way back up into the $200 region over the coming weeks as Bitcoin continues to show strength. So that's how I would be thinking about playing Solana. I think if we get any sort of move on the lower time frames back into this zone, I think that's a gift for a really well measured risk reward long. If you're riding from much lower down, you know, personally, if I had got in back here, I'd be enjoying the ride up, thinking about taking some profit up here and then some in the $200 region. So things look good for Solana. And you know, one added piece of confidence on Solana, I've been talking about this key trend line on the Solana versus gold pair that I've been charting for some time. And, you know, when this started to break down, I'll be the first to admit, I thought this was the beginning of the end. What we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that price action has actually bounced. And Solana is showing some real strength here, guys. And look, I wouldn't underestimate when you get a deviation of a really key level like this, and you can see just how clean this level is, and it dates all the way back to 2020. So you're talking about 5 years worth of price action has been held up by this one single trend line. And when you get a big deviation under like that and then a reclaim, I think that's a real sign of strength. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw the lows on this, what I thought was a distribution range, if we see those lows reclaimed. And if we do, again, I think that will be a sign that price is going to move up even further, potentially back up into these range highs. So I absolutely would not be standing in the way of Solana at the moment if I was a bear. I think price has, you know, tricked everybody on the gold pair at least into being bearish, and you know, someone like myself, I've been charting this for such a long time. This was supposed to be the trigger for big downside. That hasn't materialized. Normally what you get once you see a fake out in one direction is rapid expansion in the other direction. So would not surprise me in the slightest to see Solana get to a place where it's going to close to double before we see Bitcoin completely rolling over. If that were to happen, again, this is what the higher time frame looks like. I could see us taking out the all-time high at about $300. Again, nothing is out of the question. So in my mind, there are two options here for Solana. One is that we top out into this region as BTC hits that 115k mark. We come back down, eventually test this, and I expect us to break lower. The other is that if we see real appreciation on the Solana Bitcoin pair, I could see this going up even further and swiping the all-time high before falling over. Look, the tops and the bottoms are getting harder to catch on crypto. I think so many people are into technical analysis now that it actually makes the market a lot harder to read. I do expect eventually this big uptrend to break to the downside, and I'm surprised that the equivalent trend line on the gold pair hasn't held after we broke it to the downside. But I suspect eventually this is going to give way, and I do anticipate price trading a lot lower at some point in 26/27. So nothing changed on the higher time frames for me, but tops are messy. And if you look back here, you had September 21 through to January 22, you had 4 or 5 months of sideways price action, a fake out to the upside. Then we came back into this region. It looked like we were retesting a weekly SR zone, but eventually that gave way. These tops are getting increasingly messy, and trying to pick a beautiful short off of a high is not as easy as it once was. So I would not rule out anything in terms of upside. And in fact, the higher we go, the more I suspect everybody will become increasingly bullish on Solana, and that would be a great point for a price to roll over and shock everybody. Final Solana chart. So you'll remember way back here when this distribution came to a conclusion with a downside break on the Solana Bitcoin pair earlier in the year. That was the point in which I said I expect price to trade much lower. Obviously, it's held up a little better than I thought it would in the short term, for the reasons that I've just discussed. The fact that we saw that fake out on the gold pair, the fact that Bitcoin has actually held up and is propping up the cryptocurrency market. But I would still be cautious about assuming that Solana is going to outperform absolutely everything. I think what we're seeing here is potentially nothing more than a short-term rally that will see a macro lower high on Solana versus Bitcoin, and eventually we will see price roll over and paint something like the kind of downside that I've laid out here with this blue squiggle. So look, the only way I would be long-term bullish on Solana as a market winner, as a market leader, would be if we got a clean reclaim and on the weekly we started to hold here. To me, that would be a really strong indication that Solana is going to outperform. And in that scenario, you would have to see strength across the rest of the market. So you'd have to see Bitcoin also going significantly higher than the 110, 115K mark. I don't personally see that happening, but look, this is crypto. You don't rule anything out, guys. And markets can bounce around and continue to go higher longer than most bears can survive. The trick is to not be greedy with your trades. Don't over leverage. If you are focused on buying opportunities in 26, 27, potentially waiting for the much bigger drop to play out, then I would not be fiddling with lower time frame stuff on Solana, particularly on futures. I just think it's a recipe for getting blown apart. But be open-minded about upside on Solana and the rest of the market if we see a reclaim of the low on this distribution range. That will be a trigger for much more upside. So that's how I'm seeing Solana at the moment. To recap, short term, absolutely still seeing more upside. Big confirmation of that view on the Solana versus gold pair, and I suspect we're going to potentially rally up into the range high here in about the $200 mark. At a stretch, we could rally even harder up into the $300 zone and sweep the previous high. But the fact that I'm expecting BTC to go up by another 18, 19, 20%, I can't see Solana having the strength on the Bitcoin pair to reclaim these lows. Like I say, if I'm proven wrong, I will happily admit defeat and join you all in going long. But for now, I suspect that any high on Solana versus Bitcoin will be capped in this zone here, and that will be the trigger for further downside. So that's how I'm seeing Solana, building off of my view on Ethereum and Bitcoin. And I wanted to revisit the Nasdaq I tell you what, let me start with this chart. You will have seen this chart before if you tune into my videos regularly, or you stop by on X to see some of the charts that I've been posting in recent weeks. I've said, if you look back, this red circle I said would mark the top, and that we were painting a similar pattern to the one that we did here. We had swiped the highs, and that eventually this uptrend would break, and then this key SR zone here would give way, and we'd see more downside. And that's exactly what's happened. We have seen a pretty significant bounce off the lows. I think we must be up something like 10-15% now, 16%. And that's fantastic. That's great, right? Like if you're a bull, if you caught some of this upside, if you went long as everybody was capitulating and was terrified and jumping out of the market, good for you. Congratulations. Genuinely really pleased for you. But I think it's really important that we don't get carried away and that we take a rational view on what has happened here. You've got a structure that has carried price up for the best part of 2 years, has given way, and we've seen a big breakdown beneath this key support and resistance zone, which was initially capping price, and then we saw what looks like a big deviation over the top of it. What I would love to see is for price to continue to rally over the next week or two, to take out this high here, a bit like we did back here. We put in a high, we came down, we bounced up back into that same region before price rolled over in a big way. Now, I would love to see something like that. And I am probably going to avoid trading indexes at the moment. I just don't think it's worth the headache. Particularly if you're going short. I just think risk reward is always skewed in favor of bulls. But if that happens, to me, that would be a beautiful trade, thinking about going short in this region. And I suppose the point that I want to make more generally is that with crypto in particular, everybody is so focused on price action, right? We all have the chart in front of us pretty much 24/7. We're watching the 1 hour, the daily chart. But it's really important that occasionally you zoom out and just see where we are. There is nothing there is nothing bullish about this setup on the Nasdaq right now. And I know quite a few people are still calling for a massive blow off top. People like Henrik Zeberg and others see price appreciating and going parabolic, and us getting a massive sort of blow off top akin to the one that we saw back in the year 2000 before price collapses. I just don't think we're going to see that. I think to some extent this move up here it wasn't a blow off top in its truest sense, but this was the big squeeze that forced everybody out of short positions, forced everybody back into the market. We've seen record exposure among retail investors, particularly on tech stocks. And I think we are now in this painful place where we are putting in a lower high before rolling over. And so when I go back to the really big picture, to me, it looks like we're somewhere in this zone here where this big uptrend has held for 15 years in the same way that we saw, albeit a much steeper rise off of this trend line back in the dot-com boom. And I think we are starting to see the early signs of a big collapse in price. And I suspect that we could hang about up here for a little while before coming back into this zone, as I outlined here many months ago, back in December. That's what I'm expecting to play out. That all of this in the rearview mirror is just going to look like a right shoulder. We talk about a complacency bounce where price comes back up and everybody's celebrating and everybody thinks this is just the start of another move up. But then before you know it, price does something like this. Excuse me. So look, I suppose what I'm saying is if you're bullish and you're trying to catch longs, great, all power to you. We've certainly seen a pretty sizable bounce on crypto and equities in recent weeks, but I wouldn't be getting carried away. When I look at this chart and I look at the fact that we've broken down from this upward channel that has held for a couple of years, to me, this feels like nothing more than a bear market bounce. And eventually, as we start to make new lows, we'll retest this uptrend that has held for 15 years and it will break. The next time we touch it, I truly believe it will break. And if you go back to the first video that I posted back in March, you'll see that there's all sorts of reasons for that, not least the yield curve is disinverting, and that has historically been a great sign that we are on the brink of a major economic crisis. And I keep saying that I expect the downside that we're going to experience on this move will be akin at least to what we saw back in 2008 during the financial crisis. So I am anticipating that we're going to see something like a 70% decline on the Nasdaq, and that is precisely why I'm finding it hard to be long-term bullish on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Now, of course, there is always a small chance that Bitcoin decouples and just goes on an absolute rampage, and maybe there's some sort of monetary crisis that fuels that. I think that's what a lot of people are hoping for, which is a slightly strange thing to hope for. But honestly, I think what is more likely is that Bitcoin continues to be a sort of leveraged play on the Nasdaq, and that eventually, if the Nasdaq rolls over by 70 odd %, I expect Bitcoin to get absolutely obliterated. People think I'm crazy for saying that I expect Bitcoin to come down by 95%, but look, this crash here, right? 77% in 2022, and we saw during that time, I think we saw something like a 30% correction on the Nasdaq. If I'm right and we get a much deeper correction on the Nasdaq, potentially 60, 70, 75%, what is going to happen to Bitcoin in that scenario? I just don't believe that Bitcoin is going to be flying to the upside as people are flooding out of markets and trying to get back into the US dollar. In my mind, that is just a ludicrous thing to believe in. And look, if we start to break above this trend line and hold, then I will reconsider my position and think about whether or not Bitcoin is actually long-term bullish. But for now, I've got to assume this is going to hold once more, and that as equities put in that lower high, crypto, everybody thinks it's decoupled and it's going much higher. I think people will be pretty euphoric up here, and I suspect that price will get back under, and then we'll see real signs of exhaustion. That remind me a little bit of this period down here where, we put in a high, we then consolidated, a fair bit of volatility on that consolidation, yes, but ultimately we bounced back and took out that high before rolling over into the proper bear market correction. And I can see something exactly like that happening here. And certainly what I'm seeing on the Nasdaq gives me real belief that on this right shoulder, on this complacency bounce, we will see extreme bullishness on Bitcoin just at the point of maximum risk. And I posted this. I don't often chart in linear form. Often most of what I do is in log form. But earlier in the week I posted this just to make the point that, look, if you were being completely dispassionate, if you were being objective, this kind of price action does start to look like a bubble, a real parabolic move to the upside. And I know people will say, well, that's the linear chart, and you probably could have said the same thing here. But at the very least, I think this gives us reason to pause for thought. And when you view this in conjunction with the disinversion that we're seeing on the yield curve, I really do believe that this gives us at least an opportunity to pause and think about whether we are on the brink of a much deeper correction. And like I keep saying, I am anticipating that in the coming weeks, we are about to put in that lower high, that complacency shoulder, the move where everybody thinks, oh, look, it's a return to normal. Price is going to continue to go up. The bears are stuffed. But actually what we get is a return to the lows. And then eventually the real collapse starts to begin. And it's interesting, if you look back, right? if we are here, people in crypto are impatient. They expect everything to play out overnight. But if we are here, back in 2000, from there to the bottom of the market, you were talking about 125 weeks. So you're talking about over 2 years, right? Now, what would the same move mean? It would mean that we're well into 2027, potentially mid to late 2027, before we might see a bottom on the Nasdaq. Now, that doesn't have to play out perfectly, but even as we started to put in our first lower high, back here during the dot-com crash, you're talking about the best part of a year before this started to bottom. And if you measure from up here, it was probably more like a year and a half. So I just think now is the time to be patient. Don't get drawn into every move on the 1 hour, the 4 hour, the 1 day chart. Stick to focusing on the bigger picture here, guys. And yes, Bitcoin could make a nominal new high, but does that really mean that it's on the brink of a historic bull run? I don't think so, with equities looking like this. And if you keep a level head, I think there will be big rewards ahead for people looking to scoop up some bargains in 2027. And, really use those 2 years, as I'm thinking about, to hone your skill, to be more familiar with the market, to think about what might bounce back the hardest when we bottom. That's the way I'm plotting my next couple of years in the market. Certainly not in a rush to get back into any long-term long positions. I'll just wrap up really quickly with the dollar chart, because this one's been frustrating me, guys. I've been bullish on the dollar for some time, and I think as we started to bottom and this key support and resistance zone held, I was saying, particularly back here, last summer, sort of August time, that I expected that to mark the bottom and that we would see a really significant rally. Eventually, I expected us to come up and test the upper boundary of this macro rising channel and potentially take out these highs here before we see the dollar roll over in a big way. And what has baffled me recently is that we've seen such weakness in the dollar. Interestingly, just about the time when equities started to roll over in a big way, so too did the dollar. But then you look back at what happened in early 2008. So as equity markets began to get hit quite hard in the early part of the great financial crisis, the dollar also got whacked as well. And we saw the dollar index go from 77 to 71, so about a 10% decline, before it just went on this absolute tear to the upside as the rest of the crisis unfolded. And I was expecting a couple of weeks back for something similar to play out here, that we would come back into this support and resistance zone again, and that as equity started to put in that right shoulder and started to roll over for a much longer term, deeper correction, the panic would set in and people would flood into the dollar. What has thrown me is that we've now started to see daily and weekly closes beneath this key support and resistance zone. And what I've been trying to work out is whether that means more downside is on the way. I think confirmation would be that we break the lower boundary of this upward channel. If that were the case, then this would be different from all of the other major corrections that we've seen since the year 2000, where traditionally in a major correction, as people flood out of equities, as we saw in 2008, they have to be flood into something else, right? And if you're selling equities, what are you buying? What's on the other side of that trade? It's the US dollar for the most part, especially if you're getting out of US equities. So I still find it hard to believe, if I'm right about equities and cryptocurrency, I still find it hard to believe that we're not going to see some upside for the dollar. And we've started to see on the 2-week time frame, we're about 8 hours away from 2-week candle close. We're starting to see more of a kind of bullish hammer on this candle, potentially reclaiming these lows here. I think there is a decent chance that we will break back into this zone and reclaim all of this key support and resistance level and that would be the trigger for a much bigger move to the upside throughout the next couple of years as equities face significant turmoil. So that's what I'm looking for. I did the other day, I made the big mistake that I promised myself I wouldn't make anymore, which was looking at the daily time frame and starting to reach conclusions that we had seen a breakdown. And I always remind myself, if you are charting on the higher time frame, you wait for the candle close. And so that's what I'm going to be doing next week. Midweek, we will see the end of the April candle. And if this continues to be bought up and we get a close somewhere up here in the 100 region, I think that would be a good sign that there's some strength coming back into the US dollar, and that the dollar index is about to appreciate, and we might potentially see some sort of blow off top here before we see a break of this upward channel, this rising channel later in the decade. So look, I hope that's helpful. It's just useful for me, I find, to lay out some of my ideas in a bit more detail on YouTube than it is over on X. Like I say, if you've liked and enjoyed any of the analysis, if you find some of the short-term trade setups useful, if you find some of the bigger picture, more macro stuff interesting, then please do hit the subscribe button. I would love to have you with me on a more regular basis. It's been great to spend a bit of time with you. Good luck with however you choose to play the markets. I wish you a fantastic weekend, and I will speak to you all soon. Take care.